From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk Radio Network and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports.
The architect of the Great Society takes on Washington dysfunction, gridlock, the corrupting influence of big money, hyper-partisanship, and control by the wingnut extremists, fixing our damaged democracy before it's too late. That's tonight on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Joseph Califano Jr. spent 30 years in Washington at the top of the Pentagon on the White House staff under LBJ, where he was referred to as the Deputy President for Domestic Affairs, and as U.S. Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare under President Jimmy Carter. Worked as an attorney for the Washington Post during Watergate. He's the founder of the National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse at Columbia University. New book just out, Our Damaged Democracy, We the People Must Act. Welcome, Joe. It's a great honor to have you, and it's great to have an establishment guy taking on the establishment.
Well, it's great to be on your show, and the establishment needs to be taken on.
In an overview sense, how damaged is our democracy, and is the U.S. in a permanent decline?
Well, I think what's happened is the three branches of government have lost their constitutional bearings. The president is overwhelmingly powerful. He has become the legislator-in-chief for the country because of he issues 20 regulations for every law the Congress passes. Beginning with Ronald Reagan, in signing statements when they enact laws, presidents often say, I'm not going to follow this provision, or I don't agree with that provision, I'm not going to do it. Presidents have sent hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Americans into combat since World War II. 1 million people have been injured. Over 100,000 have been killed. There is no declaration of war. Most people today don't realize that the Constitution gives the Congress the exclusive power to declare war. And thirdly, the president signs all these agreements with foreign countries, and what I call trick-or-treaty. Many of them would be treaties under any understanding of the Constitution or anything we were doing just 50 years ago. Today, the presidents call them executive agreements and just sign them. And what does the Congress do? The Congress sort of sits back. I call it a crippled Congress. All you have to do is think about the past week when we had the Congress could barely get a bill to stop shutting down the government. We don't have individual appropriations bills. They don't look at everything that every agency by agency. They spend enormous amounts of time raising money. An incumbent senator, we calculated, has to raise $30,000 a week every week of his 6-year term to have enough money to run for office. That's on average. For a House member, it's $15,000 a week every week of their 2-year term on average to run for office. We are out of whack, and the Congress has done a lot to really cut its nose to spite its face in many ways. And the primary system, the gerrymandering that's going to be decided in some way, somehow this year, when you have safe districts, and to put this in perspective, there are 435 House members. When I worked for Lyndon Johnson, there were about 100 safe districts. That is, districts which were won by 10% or more by the candidate. There are 402 out of 435 safe districts today. And what happens? The election is in the primary. Most people don't vote in primaries. Primaries have the active elements of each party, and what's happening is that the Republican candidates get pushed further and further to the right edge, and the Democrats further and further to the left edge, and there's no room for discussion or compromise.
All right, Joe, we're going to go into more detail on this, sort of these amazing facts. I thought it was an interesting juxtaposition that you were probably at the height of the big government in the modern era when the Great Society was done, and then you were on at the beginning of the end of the era in big government when Jimmy Carter ran as an anti-Washington candidate. I want to get your thoughts on that, and is Trump the natural evolution now, almost a reality show president?
Well, it's interesting. The Great Society, there were four things that contributed to big government in Washington. One was the income tax in 1916. The second was the New Deal. And the biggest of all, you're right, Jim, was the Great Society. We pumped programs in. When Johnson became president, there were about 50 domestic programs. When he left, there were 500. When you've done that, it becomes imperative for the Congress to perform their function of overseeing the executive. Is the executive doing what they're supposed to do? Are they obeying the law? Are they issuing appropriate regulations? And don't underestimate the power of the executive today because, just stop and think about simple things, Social Security disability. Congress passed a law about Social Security disability written in very broad terms. It's the president's branch that will define what constitutes it. Medicare and Medicaid are passed, but in Medicare, as everyone who is 65 or over knows, it's really the regulators that say, okay, this pharmaceutical is covered, this medical service is covered, this one isn't. So there's enormous power there. That kind of power needs to be supervised, and Congress isn't supervising it. And that is a very serious problem. Now, the swing in the attitude of the people, I think people don't like big government except their big government. It's like doctors. They get angry about the medical profession, but they love their doctor. And what my point in the book is, the president is not being supervised anymore. And the president has given up on the legislative process because Congress is so crippled. So what does Obama do? He put out all kinds of executive orders. Well, presidents can change executive orders. What does Trump do? He's changed a lot of those executive orders. I remember years ago, the labor movement and the civil rights movement wanted Lyndon Johnson to sign an order establishing fair housing, ending redlining. Remember redlining?
Yeah.
In districts, so you couldn't get any blacks in or minorities. Well, Johnson kept saying, sign the order. And he kept saying, Joe, if I sign, this is going to be very unpopular. It's important. But if I sign an order, the next president can change it. We have to have a law. Well, it took us 3 years, but we got a law. 3 years and actually King's assassination, and we got the law passed. Today, presidents seem to just say the hell with it. They're impossible to deal with up there. I'll just sign an executive order. And we're seeing with what Trump is doing to what Obama did. You remember, Trump ran and he said, executive orders, you can't run the government on this basis. I've laid this out in the book. And then Trump comes in. He's issued more executive orders than any president in history in the first few months.
We got about a minute to go. And this, if you could do this quickly, what was it like to work for a president that was perhaps the most brilliant politician and then one who may have been amongst the least brilliant, Carter and Johnson?
Well, it was dramatically different. I mean, Johnson knew everything and everybody about Congress. Johnson had enormous focus. He knew what he wanted to do. It was poverty, it was civil rights, and he also knew that the country was changing. We were going from the corner drugstore to the big chain drugstore. We were going from the corner grocer to the big supermarket. All these things were being nationalized. So we needed a host of consumer laws. He knew what he wanted to do. I think President Carter came to, and he loved Washington. He loved to sit, drink, and schmooze with those guys. Carter did not like Washington. He had a perception of corruption in the Congress. And I mean the soft corruption. Soft corruption has now become monumental in terms of the amounts of money, and he never quite connected with those guys, and he was not. He did try to pass a health care plan, but he couldn't succeed because he got in a presidential fight with Teddy Kennedy. He did try to reform the welfare system. The country wasn't ready for it. He couldn't succeed. Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich finally got it done. I think Carter was just not. He just Washington wasn't his town, and he really didn't. One of the first things he did was go after a whole bunch of public works kinds of things out in the Midwest and the Midwest, dams and
I remember
what have
that.
you. And I said, and other people did, C. Sanders, the Secretary of the Interior, Bergson, the Secretary of Agriculture, said, Mr. President, if you do this, you'll never get anything out of those guys. Never. He said, we're right. We're going to do it. We're right.
You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell of the Biz Talk Radio Network, 350 stations around the country. Go to biztalkradio.com, find the closest one to you, listen over the Internet. Next, we'll go deeper inside our damaged democracy with Joe Califano. Stay with us. We're back with longtime Washington leader Joe Califano. We've been talking about the concentration of presidential power and the erosion of congressional power at the same time. You know, and you went through some of those amazing stats. I think in 2016 there were 3,800 regulations issued from the executive and only 213 acts of legislation. The growth of the White House staff, I hadn't realized too. 14 staffers under LBJ is now 4,000. Talk about that.
Well, yeah, it's about it's much larger. And let me give you an example. The National Security Council is about 450 people, but the one I would really focus on is the part of the staff that deals with the press. The president now runs a state-run media. There are probably 500 people that are doing nothing but press, you know, whitehouse.gov, 24 hours a day. You can get anything 24 hours a day, 3 or 4 operations from the White House. The tweeting, the constant policing of social media so that if you do something or write something and they want to answer it, it's answered right away. And, there are just hundreds of people doing that. This is the kind of social media, one CBS reporter, Bill Platt, who covered the White House for years, said it's just not a democracy in that sense. So, and the other thing about the enormous White House staff is it overwhelms the cabinet. We don't know who cabinet officers are. We know General Kelly is the chief of staff of the White House.
Yeah.
That's the most powerful job. He's more powerful than the Secretary of State or the Defense or any of the other cabinet officers whose names we just don't even know. And the other thing, Lyndon Johnson had 1 or 2 lawyers as his White House counsel. I would guess that that has gone up. I don't have to guess. I mean, that kept going up and hitting 50 and 60 during the Clinton years and thereafter. And now I think with all the problems Trump has, it's probably 50, not counting all the outside counsel. And you know, that gives the president his own lawyers. So he doesn't like what the Justice Department says. He gets an opinion from his lawyers. This is not a Trump problem, incidentally. Barack Obama asked his Attorney General, Eric Holder, whether what we were doing in Libya was considered hostilities, because if hostilities, then you had to notify the Congress, get their approval, or pull out in 60 days. Holder said, yes, it is hostilities. Obama didn't like that decision. He went to his own White House counsel, who said, no, it isn't. He followed his White House counsel. That's the world. And incidentally, the court is also infected by this. You don't need a high school education to know that Washington isn't working, and people think it's one president or something like that. It is not one president. It is not one court. It is not one Congress. This is something that's been accumulating for 50 years, and we, the people, have got to do something about it. And
hey, Joe, if we look at the decline of Congress, they don't use general order anymore. It's a 3-day work week. You say they don't know each other. The earmarks they've sort of abolished. What about the whole dysfunction of Congress?
The dysfunction of Congress is appalling. And look at it. You're right. They don't talk to each other. And you look just this week, there's a story in the Washington Post, I think, in which the staff members on the House Intelligence Committee, the minority and majority are building walls to separate the staff members from the Republican side and the Democratic side. That's incredible. They can't just take that committee. They can't even talk to each other. So the Republicans put out one memo a week ago, and the Democrats will put out another memo next week. They don't talk to each other. They're not in town. Where are they? Congress starts on Tuesday morning. They go home on Thursday afternoon. They fly either to their home district or to New York or Dallas or Palm Beach or Chicago or San Francisco or Los Angeles to raise money. And then they come back. They often figure it so you don't have any votes for most of Tuesday, so you can come in later in the day Tuesday. It is a disgrace. They are not fulfilling their responsibility. And you see it, every once in a while you really see it in a really ugly way like we're seeing it on the House Intelligence Committee. And it's there was a day, and the other thing is, if I could mention just a little bit of your business, Jim, but I mean, the White House press coverage, what's offered now, I don't mean White House, but Washington government politics press coverage. You can get your own facts. If you like the facts at Fox, you listen to Fox. If you like the facts at MSNBC or close to them now, CNN, you listen to them. And there are no unifying facts. There is no Walter Cronkite. There aren't 3 national news channels anymore. We have a situation in which an individual can just look at television as an echo chamber. And too many of these cable channels don't look at the public the way you do. As citizens, that you have an obligation as a journalist to report, give them the facts, get the facts out there so they know what they are. Rather, we have people that look upon the audience as customers. Give them what they want to hear, and then they'll sign up and listen, and our ratings will go up. So we have, and one other thing with Congress, money is killing Congress. There's no question about it. It's phenomenal amounts of money, billions of dollars spent by lobbyists. I think $3.2 billion in 2015 just on lobbying, not counting all the campaign contributions. And that is a real killer for these guys. And these lobbyists, the people that work on the Hill work 3 or 4 years and then go to work somewhere else mostly. These lobbyists are experts. They're experts in tax, or they're experts in carried interest, or they're experts in what a corporate tax rate will do, or how you can, and they're much more sophisticated. They end up writing laws. They write statements from members of Congress. They write floor speeches. They write paragraphs in reports so that lawyers later on can use those paragraphs when they're arguing cases before administrative agencies. We need a real, and lastly I will say, Jim, I must say this. We've made it so hard for somebody to run. People no longer, first question used to be, how can I change the world? How can I make my district better, or my state, or my city or town? The first question now is, how can I raise the money to run? Where can I get the money to run from? And then from there, you slide down.
The root of all evil in politics is coming next. We've just had a good lead in it. It's right there. Stay with us. Back, Joe Califano joins us, and it's Our Damaged Democracy, We the People Must Act. It's coming out right now as we speak. And as we talked about, the root of all political evil is money. And there's a great little footnote from the book that I love. Jesse Unruh was the California Assembly leader, well known for years. And he wrote, if you can't take their money, eat their food, screw their women, and vote against them, you don't belong here. We don't see much of that courage anymore, do we, Joe?
No, we don't. I mean, money really, public policy is smothered, I should say, by big money. And it comes in a whole lot of different ways. The amounts are staggering. I mean, when you think about the fact that to run a presidential election, it's going to be over $1 billion per candidate. Probably was this last time, if you could collect all the money. But it's also there's so much single issue money out there now, and of course we've always known. There are the oil industry pumps a lot of money in the banking industry. The hedge fund guys that have carried interest, which is not treated as the same kind of wages you and I earn. Mm-hmm. We've had that. But now we have a multi-billionaire decides you must, if you recite the global climate policy we should have, exactly the way I want it, I'll give you millions of dollars. If you're, otherwise you won't get anything. If you're pro-life, you'll get some money. If you're pro-abortion, you'll get some money. But otherwise, you won't get any money from me. There's an enormous amount of single interest money, and that fragments our society. We have not had this kind of money there in all the years I was in Washington. Of course, there was money, and of course, contributions were really important. But it was nothing like the problem we have today.
One stat you have in there really blew me away. In 2016, the super PACs gave $1.1 billion, but here's the number: $500 million came from just 16 couples.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
It is amazing. And the other thing I didn't realize is individual pyramiding. They say the limits are whatever, 5,400 or something between the primary and the general, but you say an individual can really end up giving $359,000.
Yeah, somebody, they did. Actually, even more than that, Jim. We put a pyramid in. There's a pyramid in the book about how Hillary Clinton, how George Clooney and Barbara Streisand and others could donate $350, as you said, $9,000 to Hillary Clinton. But in fact, the individual is supposed to be allowed to donate only up to $5,400 to a candidate, $2,700 in the primary and $2,700 in the general election. However, that individual can write a check for $10,000 to each of the 50 states. That's $500,000. And the states can turn that over to the candidate. It's not counted as being given to the candidate. They can donate money to the Republican and national committees. It's not counted. And then the Supreme Court in its decisions has created this world of what's called super PACs, where I donate the money to a super PAC, millions of dollars, and they can run ads, and so long as they don't say, this is for candidate Smith, or I'm voting for candidate Smith, those super PAC, that money doesn't count. It's just been absolutely astonishing. And there's another thing that people should have to realize. In a presidential campaign, what happens? In 2016, in 14 states where about 30% of the eligible voters live, 99% of all spending on presidential TV was spent in those states. I mean, think about that. And we really the culprit there, and I say, there are a lot of people should be indicted for all this stuff. The Supreme Court should be convicted. I mean, they have got to back off their position that money is speech. That money is free speech. What we need to do is give the Congress some flexibility to legislate some restrictions here. Because what happened? Why? Because it dilutes my vote and it dilutes your vote. And it's the money that is selecting the candidates. we get down to the wire, and so our choice is Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump. And everybody says, one candidate was erratic, an egomaniac. Why should I go for that candidate? The other candidate was entitled and said nothing and did nothing. Why should I go for the candidate? Well, let me make 2 points about that. One, money was the key to both of them. Money. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And secondly, Hillary Clinton got the Democratic nomination with 8% of the registered Republicans. Donald Trump got the Republican nomination by carrying 7% of the registered Republicans. So if you're a Republican or a Democrat, for God's sakes, get out there early. Don't bitch that I can't stand the candidates. You're the reason those are the candidates. You're sitting on your hands is the reason. And I hope one thing we will get people to realize that the voting in the primaries, getting engaged in the public square is important. And the other point, if you let me make it now, is we have so brutalized the process. I've raised a lot of money in my life. I, as you point out, worked for Lyndon Johnson. I was in the Kennedy administration. So raising money is demeaning. However you describe it, you talk to these guys, they don't like it. A lot of the reason many of these congressmen are leaving is they just spend so much time raising money. So you have that. You can get beat up. Social media can beat you up. It's almost like mob rule. By the time you catch up with it, the fact that they said something that wasn't true, or that you did something in the back of a car when you were a 16-year-old in high school. I mean, and people say, why the hell should I subject myself to that? I wrote this book because all of these things play into each other. The stronger president and the weaker Congress feed on each other and make things worse. They help politicize the Supreme Court. From the moment the president thinks about who's my judicial candidate, he's thinking, will he support my politics? This problem of the states, we forget the states have become dependent on the federal government. I call them the dependent states. More than a third of the states get the bulk of their money from the federal government to house their people, to educate their people, to fix their infrastructure and what have you. There are no, you say there's no free lunch. In government, there are no free crumbs. What you get from the federal government, you comply with mandates. You have to hang on to their strings. So the states that used to have an opportunity, Louis Brandeis once said, to be these test tubes of democracy, their muscles are atrophying. They don't have enough chance to do some stuff on their own. With your own kids, you want your kids to get out there and do it themselves. How many parents have said, look, you have to do that. I can't do that for you. I can, but I'm not going to. You have to. States we have to get that ability back in the states. And then the one thing we haven't mentioned, which I think is critical, the racial divide in this country is increasingly along political party lines. The Democratic Party, the last time the Democratic Party got a majority, over 50% of the white vote, was in 1964 when Lyndon Johnson ran. Since then, it's got a slipping percentage. It now is hovering between 30 and 40%. The Democratic Party of Lyndon Johnson got 90+% of the black vote, and most candidates since then have done that. Hillary Clinton didn't. She only got 88%, and the turnout was low. And that demonstrated that it's very difficult for a Democrat to win a national election without 90% of the black vote. Now think about what this means. If the Democrats become the party of blacks, and the Republican and other minorities, and the Republicans become the party of whites, then it makes it much harder for them to compromise and deal. I got to get what I need for my people. They're each going to be saying. And that's one of the reasons why they can't make the deals they used to make.
Our final national segment will be coming right up. How do we fix it? With Joe Califano will help us figure that out. Thirty-year Washington veteran Joseph Califano. How do we fix it before it's too late? And Joe, first off, how do we restore this one man, one vote, and the curbing the influence of money?
The first step in dealing with the influence of money that devastates one man, one vote is the Supreme Court. We've got to get that decision reversed. And I think now there's enough evidence to show the corruption of money and how debilitating it is to our society. There is an appendix in the book.
Yes.
It lists every single Democrat. It's from 2013, and how much money they were required to raise for their campaign committees. It has how much cash they had on hand, how much they'd received, how more they had to get, and also indicates, incidentally, one point I'll make quickly, and we have a pay-to-play Congress.
Yes.
If you want to be chair of the Appropriations Committee or the Defense Committee, the committees that oversee big bucks, big private bucks, you have to raise a hell of a lot more money than if you're going to chair, say, the Agriculture Committee. And we're talking $500,000 for your campaign committee, and for the Republicans even more. I couldn't get a Republican chart like this, but I guarantee you there is one. And I hope people take a look at it because it's a shocking thing. Now, back to your point, the court is number one, and then after that, we will need a Congress. I happen to think that the ultimate solution is public financing, but that requires a Congress that's willing to appropriate sufficient funds so that candidates will choose public financing. The problem with the presidential public financing system, which we had briefly in the early 70s, was that after a couple of years, there wasn't enough money in it. So the candidates rejected it and raised money on the side. I think it is very important for the reason I think education is so important is I think we need to have informed voters. And when we're dealing in a world in which roughly half the kids graduating from high school do not meet basic standards of English and basic standards of math, we're talking about a level of comprehension that makes them very vulnerable for these madmen in the advertising business and for the world of tweets and fake news. I think that's important. I think people have to get engaged. It's not, I voted in the last election. Let's get real. By the time it's the last election, it's either Trump or Hillary. There were lots of other candidates hanging out there. You have to get involved at that stage if you want to really have a say in who your candidate is going to be. I think that is critically important. I think we have to really hold our Congress members accountable and say, what the hell are you guys doing? You are, in the last 20 years, I think there's only 1 year when you actually had appropriations bills. Everything's been run by a continuing resolution or something like that. Something so big, thousands of pages, nobody knows what's in it. What are you doing? You're spending all your time raising money? As I point out in the book, call time for Democratic congressional candidates, call time. It's a euphemism for calling to raise money. It's 6 hours a day when you're in Washington.
Yeah, unbelievable. Hey, Joe, do you think that you mentioned that, great civilizations die from within? I remember that we had statesmen Howard Baker, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Everett Dirksen, Jacob Javits, even LBJ. Are we missing statesmen now in Washington?
Absolutely. We're missing statesmen. You really can see that. I mean, there would be no great society if half the Republicans hadn't come along. Now, what did that mean? Well, what it meant was, I was a young tiger then. I was saying to Johnson, you can't give in on this on Medicare. You can't give in on that. You can't do this. And Johnson said, this is a complicated bill. Medicare and Medicaid are hard to execute. If we don't have half the Republicans, we're going to have trouble with it. So we are going to give, and we gave. And he gave to Dirksen, gave to others. I mean, I think, and lots of conversation. And I think that is very important. I also think, this lack of talking that you mentioned earlier in the broadcast, the problem is the only reason somebody goes to the Senate floor is like Rand Paul this past week to do some tub-thumping speech that might get a little television time. The debates that Daniel Webster had or Everett Dirksen and Hubert Humphrey had, we don't see those debates anymore. My hunch is that probably few people, if any, under 40, that have ever seen a real debate on the Senate floor or the floor of the House. This is a tragedy. It's a tragedy for our democracy. And the other thing, I think we do have to get over, saying to people, I will never vote for him because he isn't with me on climate. I will never vote for her because she's against gun control or for gun control. I will never vote for this person because they're pro-life or pro-choice. We can't live like that. That fractures our society. Vote for people because they have character, because they generally are in line with your views. A citizen shouldn't be so myopic that there's only one issue they care about. We had, sure there are overarching issues. My God, I lived through them with the Vietnam War, and we certainly lived through them with the civil rights programs in the 60s. I understand it, but those were vast issues. These other issues are relatively narrow issues. I'll only vote and give money to prosecutors who will not enforce marijuana laws. Yeah. I mean, which we have from Soros, and this is, it's not one-sided. It's not the Koch brothers. It's the Koch brothers and Soros and Steyer and just an array of people, and that's part also. The reason I say these things feed into each other, we wouldn't have that if we didn't have this monumental concentration of wealth. What do you do if you're worth a couple of $100 billion? You got to do something with your money. So one of the things you do is you buy laws you want to see passed that'll make you more or make you more comfortable.
I want to thank Joe Califano. That's a good way to end it. He's really calling for us to raise up, we the people. Thanks for 30 years of service and now taking on the establishment. The book is Our Damaged Democracy, We the People Must Act. This has been Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Thanks to Joe Califano. Thanks to our national audience for listening. We'll see everybody next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell.
And welcome now to our segment 5, which is Overtime. It's exclusively for Yale Radio. A senior political columnist writes a love story to his son and unburdens himself of the burdens of parental expectations. A son with Asperger's syndrome on the autism spectrum. And then we talk with the founder of Autism Speaks, who was also the former CEO of NBC. We'll top everything off with a little politics, and that's all today on a special edition of Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Ron Fournier is senior political columnist for the Atlantic Magazine and the National Journal. He began his reporting career in Arkansas covering Governor Bill Clinton. He's also covered the presidencies of Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. The new book moves outside the political realm to a more personal one, Love That Boy, What Two Presidents, 8 Road Trips, and My Son Taught Me About Parents' Expectations. That's a big mouthful. Welcome, Ron.
Thanks for having me. Happy Grandfather's Day.
Thank you very much. We just became a first grandfather, so it's very exciting. I guess why don't we just start off with the obvious. What exactly is Asperger's, and what is the story behind Love That Boy as a title?
Well, first, thanks for having me on, and again, Happy Father's Day, and to you, Grandfather's Day. Asperger's syndrome is on what they call the high end of the high-functioning autism. It's basically the social graces that were born into most of us, the ability to look people in the eyes and have a conversation and modulate your voice and understand how somebody is responding to you, to be able to play off of somebody. For us, that's natural. For people with Asperger's syndrome, mainly young boys, it's totally unnatural. They have to learn it. The good thing is these young men and women are blessed with unusual intelligence. They're very blunt and literal. Therefore, like my son Tyler, he can't lie if he tried, which is a great thing to have in your home if you cover politics for a living, as a young man who can't lie.
You know, it's funny, after reading, you get to know Tyler through the book, and I said, this guy's got Trump-like impulsivity, but he's honest.
Yeah, I never thought of it. That is the irony here. He does speak right from the heart in very declarative, blunt statements, like Donald Trump. You know exactly where Tyler stands, but unlike Donald Trump, who can tell 3 lies in 2 sentences, Tyler, like I said, is just incapable of being duplicitous. These guys and gals just aren't wired that way.
What does Tyler think of the book? And also begin to describe, your wife selflessly builds this sort of ecosystem of opportunities for you guys to bond.
Yeah, I'll give you the origin story. We walked out of the doctor's office where he was diagnosed at age 12. A diagnosis that actually didn't go very well because the doctor had given us the list of symptoms of autism, which we didn't know anything about. We'd never had heard of Asperger's syndrome. And one of the things she said was that Tyler is awkward and has poor hand-eye coordination, which is a symptom of autism. And I said, well, doctor, is that why he's no good at sports? And she kind of shot Lori, my wife, Lori's the hero of the book. Tyler's the star. Kind of shoots her kind of a knowing, disappointing glance and says, well, yeah, Ron, that's probably why he's not good at sports. It's also why he doesn't like sports, which I realized right then, I just turned his diagnosis for autism into a scouting report, which was emblematic of how I had raised him for his first 12 years through trying him to be like me. My dad and I had a great relationship through sports, kind of a field of dreams cliche. And I thought my son, the only way I could connect with him was through sports. Well, my wife had a different idea. We walked out of the doctor's office, and when you meet my wife, you see she's got these beautiful blue eyes, and this day they were puddled with tears. And she says, you got to step up to me. You got to step up and spend more time with Tyler, and you got to step up and get him outside of the basement, outside of the home, and out into the world. Because these things that for his first 12 years that we thought were unnatural or uncomfortable, things like shaking hands and looking people in the eyes, we now just learned are unnatural for him. He's not wired to do them. He's got to learn them. So we get in the car, and it's a 10-minute drive home. And before we get home, she literally comes up with the idea that what we're going to do specifically is spend a year on the road together, going to presidential sites and presidential museums and historical sites and their former homes, because Tyler's fixation, his obsession at the time and even now, was history. And the presidency is what kept me away from the family. We have 3 kids. Tyler's the youngest. So off we went. Lori called them road trips, and I right away started calling them guilt trips.
You talk about a parent's love being unconditional, but a parent's satisfaction comes with caveats.
Yeah.
A lot of this was sort of a guilt trip on your own. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, look, we all love our kids desperately, and because of the really complicated, scary times we're raising our kids, and because of the baggage we bring with us into parenthood, a job that none of us is prepared for, we impose all kinds of expectations on our kids. We want them to be normal, not defective, not have a special needs. And I put air quotes around defective. We want them to be popular. We want them to be brilliant. We want them to be a superstars at sports or ballet or something. We want them to go to a great college and marry the right person and have a great job. Well, all these expectations that come out of love, if we're not careful, repeat the mistakes I made, which is not just shaping my son, but I was misshaping him. I was trying to turn him into something that he couldn't be and shouldn't be, and I was sucking all the joy out of being a dad because I was anxious all the time and pressing him all the time. Instead of helping him find his passion, I was imposing my dreams on him.
The fact that there's genius level components of this. What are typical genius level components, and what is the hard stuff that they can't do? Some of what you've talked about. Yeah,
well, first of all, Tyler's IQ literally is 20 or 30 points more than his father, and even more than his mom, who's brilliant in her own way. Just literally
wow.
just blessed with a high IQ. An extreme attention to detail on things that he is focused on, that he likes to do. Now, it's hard to get him interested. It's hard to get him to do something he's not interested in. But on the things that he likes, man, he'll bore right down. Extremely loyal, extremely loving, extremely, like I said, guileless. And the interesting thing is there's a lot of jobs out in the world right now that are being filled by neurotypical people that really don't have the skills set that a autism person would bring to them and would be better suited for. And that's something that I would like to do in the next chapter of my life, is to start connecting up these unique skills, brilliance and loyalty and attention to detail, with jobs that really need those skill sets. Now, the problem is what they're not good at, what Tyler isn't good at, is functioning in a neurotypical environment of being social. He has a hard time in meetings and knowing when to speak up and when to keep his voice down and when to speak up and when to joke and when not to joke, and has a hard time reading people. And you don't realize how hard it is to do those things unnaturally until you watch a guy like my son. Some of the bravest, hardest work I've seen in my life is him just having a conversation with a stranger. And then you'll see in the book, he actually sits down and have a conversation with Bill Clinton and George Bush. The hardest, most bravest work I'll ever see in my life.
And you really get the sense from the book that you were a sports fanatic and you wanted to be that,
yeah.
And he didn't, and just it really rips your heart when I was afraid you wouldn't like me as much, Dad, if I told you that I really hate sports.
You're gonna make me tell that story? Look, I was not one of those dads that pushed his kids into sports because I wanted him to succeed where I didn't, or because we needed a scholarship, or like some dads did. I wanted him to do it because it was the only way I knew to connect with him.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's a lazy thing. I didn't try to find another way. So here we are. He's 12 years old, and one of the trips we took was to the Gerald Ford Library in Grand Rapids, my hometown, and my father was living there at the time. My father, who was a jock, and the two of us had a great relationship over sports, basically just over sports. Matter of fact, on his deathbed, we were talking about the great Gordie Howe. And we're standing in front of a showcase in dedication to Ford's incredible athletic career. And I'm explaining to my dad why I thought I'd let him down because I didn't play football in high school, that I did cross-country instead. And my dad finally interrupts me and he says, "Hey, I didn't have a problem that you didn't play football. You're not me." And then he looks at my son and he says, and he's not you. So on the way home, I think, man, I got to do something about this. So I talked to Lori, and she says, well, why don't you cut Tyler a deal? If you will do an extracurricular activity and he will do some exercise a couple days a week, tell him he doesn't have to play sports, because that was the reason, the justifiable reasons to have your kid playing sports, to get exercise and to be socially involved, be part of a team. Mm-hmm. So I cut Tyler this deal. I say, hey, how about you don't have to play sports anymore if you do these two things? And he says, you got a deal. He shakes my hand, and then he's real quiet. And finally I said, what's the matter, bud? And he says, I was afraid that if you, I can't even say it. I was afraid that if I didn't play sports, you wouldn't love me.
You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell over the Biz Talk Radio Network, 350 stations around the country. Go to biztalkradio.com, find the station closest to you. Listen over the Internet, access our archive of podcasts. Next, Tyler's going to meet some presidents. Maybe take us through George W. Bush first, and we didn't get to where Love That Boy came from, but you can link it obviously to this.
Yeah, about 9 years before he was diagnosed, and before we did the road trips, which included a visit with former President Bush, I was leaving the White House beat in 2003 to cover George Bush's re-election, and a tradition that goes way back is that presidents have a departing correspondent bring in their family as kind of a thank you to the family. So in we walk, my wife and two daughters and their baby brother Tyler, and Tyler's 5, and he starts tearing the Oval Office up, just running around and talking on and on real quick about Barney the dog, and telling Bush things about his own dog that I'm sure Bush didn't know, and then starts talking about Follow the dog, Roosevelt's dog. And I'm feeling anxious, and I'm worried that he's wasting the president's time, and he's embarrassing me. And Bush, who was very intuitive in a room, knew, I think, what I was going through, and that I was feeling anxious about my son. And as they're walking out, he grabs me by the hand and looks me right in the eyes, and he says, "Love that boy." And at the time, if you'd asked me, I would have thought, what a nice thing to say. He's telling me to love my son despite the fact that he's quirky and that he's acting out. And again, I didn't know what his condition was yet, but he was certainly being really quirky in the room. And it wasn't until 9 years later when he gets diagnosed, and I take these trips with him, and I talk to a bunch of other parents, and I talk to a bunch of child psychologists and child development experts to write this book, that I realized, no, that's not the lesson here. It's not to love my boy despite his quirkiness. It's not for all of us to love our kids despite what makes them different. It's to love them because of what makes them different. Because what makes Tyler different is what makes him so incredibly special, like we're talking about earlier. So it was a great lesson in fatherhood that he gave me.
In fact, we'll jump back and forth because I wanted to. Clinton, I find very interesting too, and you say in the book that his knowledge is almost Asperger's-like, and you've got Tyler, and they sort of went at it.
This was a big surprise. I found Tyler met with Bush and Clinton 8 days apart, and I was surprised that Bush was a lot more empathetic than Clinton. Clinton is renowned for feeling the nation's pain, but it was Bush who felt Tyler's pain. And Clinton, the way he connected with Tyler was in a way that I never would have expected. He sat down with Tyler, gave him a couple of wonderful gifts, could not have been more gracious. And then he goes on for 45-minute dialogue about Teddy Roosevelt, because he knew Tyler's favorite president was Teddy Roosevelt, and it's Clinton's favorite president. But he's comparing himself to TR and our times to TR and TR's times, and I'm taking notes. I'm fascinated by it. It's typical brilliant Bill Clinton stuff. But Tyler is bored. Tyler wants to talk. He's a teenage boy. He's an Aspie. He wants to talk, And Clinton didn't get it. So I actually wrote down in my notebook, I'm thinking, my God, Bill Clinton, of all people, is missing social clues, and he's fixated on a topic just like my son. So I wrote down in my notebook, is Bill Clinton an Aspie? Now, of course, Bill Clinton doesn't have Asperger's, but I realized then that if Bill Clinton, the most social animal of our time, if he can have rough edges socially, why am I so worried about my son? And sure enough, on the way out, I asked Tyler, I said, what'd you think, buddy, of Bill Clinton? And he says, and Clinton was just a few steps ahead of us, so he kind of whispers to me. He says, well, he likes talking a lot about himself and his stuff, which is exactly how I would describe Tyler. And I said, like you, buddy? Yeah. And Tyler says, yeah, like me. So Clinton actually kind of connected with him on almost a weirdly wired to weirdly wired person. It was really cool.
And this blew me away in terms of coincidental moments. I think you say that you interviewed Clinton right after the Paula Jones incident would have happened on that day in the hotel. Is that right?
No, I didn't realize it at the time, obviously.
Yeah, obviously, yeah.
But literally, yeah, because I went back and double-checked the article that I wrote that day. Clinton came down from a holding room that he had in the hotel, which wasn't unusual. Any public official at this hotel would have a holding room to, meet dignitaries and that kind of thing. I didn't know what Bill Clinton was doing in it, and he comes out of it, and I walked him out to the state trooper sedan, and it was asking him about rumors that he might run for president, and wrote up an article about the interview and his speech that he'd given to the Arkansas Industrial Development Commission about the global economy. And it wasn't until years later that I put two and two together and realized he had just walked out of the room with Paula Jones.
These guys are amazing, aren't they? How they just so compartmentalized.
Exactly. Now, you want to talk about compartmentalizing, though. When he brings my son up to do this gracious, wonderful thing on the sit down with Tyler at the penthouse of his library, the whole western wall of his penthouse is windows. So we're looking west from the library into downtown Little Rock, and we're looking at all these. We're kind of doing. The two of us are kind of reminiscing about. Well, there's the old newspaper office that closed down, and you used the governor as your first presidential campaign headquarters, and there's the office of your big donor, whose name escapes me as I'm speaking. And then I pointed to the hotel where the Paula Jones thing was done, and Clinton said something like, "We're not going to talk about that."
Wow. Like
20 years later, And sure enough, we should have been talking about it. He was there to do a nice favor for my son, and again, could not have been more gracious. It was a wonderful thing he did.
Now, as we get to the bottom part of this segment, I think it's important to give you a chance to talk about the fact that the book is much more universally targeted than just a story about autism. Go ahead.
Thanks for making that point. It's a very universal story that focuses on the expectations that we have for our children, where they come from, and how they affect our kids. So it's one part what I learned from my son with these road trips, as the title suggests. But the big part is, what are these expectations? And every chapter deals with one of them. We want them to be popular. We want them to be geniuses. We want them to be superstars. We want them to go to the right school. And in every chapter, I do the social science. For example, you really don't want your kids to be popular, and here's why. I bring in other parents. Most of them aren't with special needs kids because, again, it's a universal message. And then I layer in our story. I layer in Tyler's story. So hopefully it's a very easy read that will give parents the permission to set aside their guilt and to acknowledge that they're not perfect, and neither are their kids, and to help parents find that fine line between pushing your kids and guiding them. How can you be more of a guide and less of a pusher?
Since Bob Wright's Autism Speaks will be at the end of the show, have you had relationship with Autism Speaks? And I'll also say the sad case is that his grandchild is very low functioning.
Yeah, Autism Speaks is a wonderful organization that deals with the entire spectrum, from folks like Mr. Wright's grandchild, right?
Yes.
Who's not very functional, to Tyler, who will probably live an independent life. We have a great relationship with them. Autism Speaks did a video of Tyler and I at the Cooper Union in New York, where Abe Lincoln basically started his presidential campaign. And I recommend you can find it on the Autism Speaks website. It's a wonderful interview that was shot by a young man who did not speak until he was 6 years old, an autistic young man. He did he operated one of the two cameras and then edited the video, and you'll see what an amazing talent this young man is. And more importantly, you'll see, not more importantly, but to me more importantly, what a wonderful, funny, engaging, charming, charismatic young man that I have, and it took my wife kicking me in my butt to realize what a gift I had. That's
a good way to end it, and he's a comedian as well.
He's a funny boy.
George
sure
W. Bush noticed that. I guess on the YouTubes, can you just Google California? Because I've watched a couple of the YouTubes, and they really do get you right in the heart.
Yeah, you can find it on Autism Speaks, or go to YouTube and put in Fournier, which is how you spell my name, and Love That Boy, and the video will pop up from Autism Speaks. It is really cool. I recommend it.
Thanks to Ron Fournier. That was an honest interview, very insightful too. Populism coming our way. Love That Boy, What Two Presidents, A Road Trip, and My Son Taught Me About a Parent's Expectations, Harmony Books publisher. You've been listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Thank you, Ron.